Sorry?
Your mic is on the table.
Perfect. Great.
So there's no printed programs.
Okay, that's all right.
Well, actually, there weren't supposed to be. I was supposed to know that, but I didn't.
No worries. Cool. So I'll be like talking, playing,
Yeah.
lighting wise, but that's nice.
With the black one, she'll ask if they, or the red one, she'll ask if they have the next one.
That's pretty good. Well, is there any chance of something like straighter down or no? Okay. That's nice. That was good. That's good. Yeah.
your book. It's Emily, by the way.
Yes, yeah. Peter, can I take this? Can I put it on back there and just have it as I come on, or should I put it on when I arrive?
Put it on, please.
I,
Do you want me to put it on for you, or are you okay?
No, I can.
like, be dramatic. Do whatever you want.
Okay.
It's just Mark and I to myself, so experiment.
We'll be turning it on and off when you're talking and playing,
Okay,
so you don't have to bother with that.
great.
Okay.
Okay, it is on.
Do you want to test?
Yeah, sure. I'm speaking into the mic. Everybody can hear me. My vast audience, this veritable stadium packed full of people hearing me talk.
You know, Peter, you might want to turn it down a little bit. Only for, I just noticed on the YouTube. Well, actually, no, it wasn't the YouTube. I don't know. What do you think? How does the balance sound to you when you do the streaming? You hear me?
What was that, sorry?
How does the balance sound in the hall when you're doing the YouTube streaming?
I can't hear you. What? Sorry.
Sorry. It's okay. How's the balance?
Balance of.
When the speaker is speaking on the YouTube streaming? Does it sound good?
We'll check it.
Okay. Just checking.
Sure, yeah.
I'll show it to the sound check.
Let me know when you guys are ready for me to babble.
Your mic's not on, right?
I don't think it's on, no.
Testing. Keep talking.
Testing. He's working. Looks like Celia's listening
Off
there.
now?
Sorry?
Did you turn it off?
No, not on purpose. I didn't touch anything. There's a red light under low battery, but it also says on there.
There's a switch on the top of the box.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, okay. Okay, oh, there we go. Maybe it just got nudged. Testing, babbling away. Okay, today we're talking about some violin stuff. We love the violin. Love to talk about the violin. We love to.
You gotta check the microphone.
Oh, is it still not?
Well, it's working, but the Zoom mic.
Oh, okay.
Make sure we can hear you when you're talking.
No, I can't test if the YouTube is working if I'm here, right?
Oh yeah, okay.
Cecilia, does it not sound a little bit hot in the hall? Like you could be turned down just a bit. I'm just.
It does seem quite loud. Yeah.
All the sounds fine. Do you want to play something?
Yeah, sure.
His voice just sounds very boomy, like for the, I mean, there's nobody here, so.
Okay, so is that, did you get that, Peter?
Sorry, no.
Oh, she just says it's a little boomy for just the couple people in the audience. So if it can maybe come down a little bit.
Okay, back it off.
Yeah, that feels pretty natural. How's it sound?
That's good.
Okay. Okay, so we'll do that, and then, okay, I can play some stuff.
Turn your mic off.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Super. Okay, it'll get much louder and much quieter than that. Do you want those parts, or is it good?
You should be fine, thank you.
Okay. Well, the lights go down a little bit more than this for the show, right? Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. The rest of those slides are much brighter than that.
okay, great. Just checking.
Actually, can I just try one slide later on that does get pretty dark, just to make sure. Okay, I mean, let's just say something like that. Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, that's fine.
Super. Okay.
And this is being recorded, right? So that if I need to. This is so bizarre. It's like,
I know.
there won't be any,
I know.
is Mark just joining us online?
No, he is joining in person.
Okay,
Yes. Yeah.
he still has time.
Yeah.
Where's your family originally from?
Edmonton.
Oh,
Yeah.
so you're not part of the bubble. You don't have to worry about that.
No, no. No, no, just Edmonton, and we are just staying put in Toronto for as long as we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But have you, I mean, when was the last time you were in Edmonton?
I guess Christmas. Yeah.
Yeah, same with me. It's
Yeah.
just, it's trying to figure out how to get back out west.
Yeah. Yeah. Remind me, where are you from out there?
I'm from Calgary.
Oh, you're from Calgary. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just it never gets better in Alberta.
Well, it's a kind of bizarre time right now, right? That, like when do we go, when do we come back? I mean, the good thing is we don't have to go into isolation within a certain
Yeah.
area, but still,
Yeah.
it feels odd to fly, it feels odd to be with other people and.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just gonna hop slightly closer, but
Yeah.
um.
Why don't we just, you've got to think about your recital.
Oh, it's fine. But yeah, we decided to not go home for Christmas.
Mhm.
It's because my wife works in the hospital, so it's
Yeah.
you know.
We're doing the same. We're not gonna go home on Christmas. We're gonna go home maybe like after. But
Yeah. Yeah, somebody was asking me if I wanted to play a show in June in Edmonton. Well, yes.
I
Well,
know,
we'll see.
I think you kind of have to go for it, and then
Yeah.
you'll see.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But you can't, like, you can't, yeah, life can't stop, right?
Yeah, of course. And the planning can't stop. I mean, if you have to change later, that's fine. But if you start saying no to everything,
Yeah.
then you said no to everything.
So your wife's in the medical profession, like, is she here in Toronto?
Yes. Yeah. So she's an occupational therapist.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think, Toronto's one thing, I think it doesn't matter where you are. You're in a very high risk area.
Yeah, totally.
And, I'm assuming you come into school as little as possible.
Yeah, I'm fortunate that I don't like it's okay for me to practice in my apartment. So no, I basically think I've been in school I think 3 times since I returned.
No, I'm sure you found out, like, when you come in, like, there's nobody here.
Yeah, which is nice in a way. Yeah.
So you actually could practice here more often, like, I'm just saying safely, like.
Yeah.
People only really come in unless they absolutely have to.
Yeah.
And so, for the most part, I see more people in the evenings, because that's when, the rooms open up for bookings and
Right.
rehearsals and
Yeah.
stuff. But during the day,
It's spooky. Yeah.
it's bizarre.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, I'm just most of the way through my courses now. My required courses. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. Well, just tell me, Mark, if you ever wanna just like hang out and, I don't know how much you wanna play in front of other people or just sort of, but you know, the graduate, not that you have to register, I mean, it'd be great if you registered, but there's a nice community of grad students between the masters and the the DMA students that just play for each other. So if you just need a place to just, play through things for
Okay.
people in advance, if that makes you comfortable or not, maybe it does make you comfortable, I don't know.
Which is also valuable though.
Well, yeah, no, and they really are a really nice supportive, community. So you're always welcome, so.
Wonderful. Great to know. Is that happening online right now or is that?
So, yeah, this year's different, yeah, so this year, it's Thursdays, 5 to 7, and it seems like only the people that play are present,
Okay.
and everyone else zooms in.
Okay.
And so the room it's room 330, which is upstairs, huge, and given like we only have 2 or 3 people playing, there's
Yeah.
more than ample space, and really the building at that time is just, it's dead quiet. So you have the 2 or 3 people playing plus the host. Hello.
Hi.
It's a full house.
That's right.
So
Even if you wanted to put more people in here, you could.
Anyway, you should just.
sure, yes, I can
focus
get back to my
Anyway, nice to talk to you.
Yes, likewise.
How are you doing, Ellie?
Okay, how are you?
Great.
Did you walk here?
Not tonight. Ian was cooking up a storm, so took a little longer to come up with it.
I know.
So I drove into. You're looking to do something to your hair?
Yeah, I'm working on it. No, it's great.
Oh. Is that what I'm seeing from the distance?
Yeah, it's great. I'm just trying, I'm not almost ready, so that's the problem.
Oh, it looks good. I noticed it right away, so. Whatever it's doing the right thing.
I was gonna say though, if you ever, it's kind of going backwards, but if you ever need to take transit, you should walk down to Harvard
Yeah.
and take the
Take that
bus.
bus.
The bus is empty.
Yeah. Well, I haven't been on a bus or on TTC since mid-March.
No, I know, I've been on the bus like 4 times, but the bus seems to be, you know, I never take it during rush hour and
It's easy to find.
maybe 4 people on it.
Right. Yeah, it's weird, just, saying to Ian the other day, this is the longest I've gone since I was 15 years old, not getting on a plane, you know? It just feels so totally weird.
Well, and I almost don't, my sister actually just came mid-September, and I was so amazed, because she's in the medical profession, so
Right.
she took the plunge way before I did, but I still petrified of getting on a plane.
And I can't do it myself yet,
Ice has done it.
but she's done it a few times, but out of necessity, so.
Yeah.
But, anyway. I'm not adjudicating, of course, but I will just sit here quietly,
You can sit wherever you want.
see if I can find a seat.
How was Tidal? Is he still there?
He's done.
He's done?
He's done. He's actually now doing a few other things for us. Just a little odd jobs around the house, and before Ivy finds some kind of new big project for him to do.
Well, I was thinking I was gonna recommend him to somebody else, but I wasn't sure how busy he was at the moment, so.
Well, no, he's not busy with us much at all at this point, because he's done everything that needs to be done in the garage.
Maybe you can use it?
Oh yeah, we're in there.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, we're thrilled.
Like you can Zoom from there, you can teach from there.
Yeah. Well, we bought some extender pods for the Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
And that was pretty good, but the upload speed wasn't terribly strong enough for more than one person to be teaching at a time. So I could be in there with all of her gear
Yeah.
teaching, but if I'm in the house teaching at the same time, not always so great.
Not great.
So we changed providers, and now we have, instead of having like a speed of 5, the numbers, I don't, we just have Yeah, we got a 50/50, and it's basically, it's not that much more expensive than our previous provider, which was Virgin. And, but the Virgin was coupled with my cell phone, so that was one weird thing. But Virgin doesn't even offer an upload speed past 10, so we couldn't get any faster than that. And doing so much video work now, uploading videos, like I had this thing over the summer where I had to upload a video that wasn't terribly long. It was only about 9 minutes, but it was 4K. And to upload it to this guy who's going to do some editing for me, it took like 4 hours. It's ridiculous. So getting the upload speed upgrade has been a big plus. And yeah, so now we're able to be in different parts of the house and the garage all at the same time. No issue with that.
Normally we've had no problem, but like, I don't know, Wednesday, it was unbelievable, like, it was horrible, and we have 5, but I don't know what time is 5.
Are you using Bell?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, like we were both on the same Zoom call. He's,
Upstairs, you're downstairs?
And normally it's been not a problem, but, I don't know, that day was just like, and everything was just like stuttering and, so it's been hit and miss, so.
Right.
It depends on the day sometimes.
Right.
Okay, sorry, we gotta get back in. That's making drop. How are your, improv classes going at, in Boyville?
So far, so good.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's a good bunch.
We've been messing around with the mic in Boyville seems to work quite well. The one in 330, I don't know if you've been in there. We're yeah, still struggling with trying to get, like, I don't know why. The room.
Do you mean for people who are doing online?
Yeah, it's just because we were doing the combo, right? And so the people that listen online, 330 is just, I don't know, Zoom seems to cut out sometimes and then reset the audio settings. Walter Rowe, yeah, was also the weird things, and the Boyville has been very
No
stable,
problem.
but I don't know why, like what.
No, I haven't had any trouble yet. I mean, I've only really had to use the online server for students in the first 2 weeks because everyone wants to be on site for this class so far.
That's good.
But in the first 2 weeks, there were kids that were still in quarantine from getting into the country. So
Right.
what does it mean for us to study the violin? We might study it as children, as aficionados, professional performers, or academics. And in all of these scenarios, with their differing requirements, studying the violin means first arriving at an understanding of what the violin's thresholds are. We have to ask questions like, what gets allowed into the catalog of sounds that a violin makes? Or for that matter, what gets allowed into the canon of what is violin music? Exactly how much tension might there need to be between the bow and the strings to achieve the perfect ringing tone? And how much vibrato is too much for Bach, or for Mozart, or for Stockhausen? Identifying these thresholds is a necessary process. You have to know the outlines of your object of study. And as we continue to live, our certainty of these boundaries hardens, and we measure performances or texts against what we think we know about what's too much, too far, or not enough. The flaw with this development of boundaries is that boundaries exclude as much as they define. In light of this, I wanted to spend some time tonight looking at musical landscapes that don't respect boundaries, but rather inhabit them, denying any fixed dualities by wavering between worlds. There's a huge contextual richness to an in-between state, and a wide palette of possibilities for action. At any moment, the in-between state could just fall off the knife's edge and become a clearly defined object, or it could hover indefinitely undefined. The word for this phenomenon is borrowed from anthropology, although it's wound its way into other disciplines by now, and that word is liminality. The visual artist Judith Westerveld defines it this way, quote, "The word liminality is derived from the Latin word limen, meaning threshold, and closely associated with the word limus, meaning limit. Unlike a limit, a threshold is not an end point, but a midpoint that allows fluid crossing of or wavering between two worlds." And as this word has entered more common usage, it's also come to mean the following: situated at a sensory threshold, barely perceptible or capable of eliciting a response, or being an intermediate state, phase, or condition, in between, transitional. In this lecture recital, we'll find liminality where you might expect to, in the Italian avant-garde, in the Beckett-inspired writing of Georges Courtauld, and in contemporary Canadian music. But it's also there, even in places that we long ago enshrined as defining the very boundaries of classical music performance. Of course, I'm not proposing that liminality is a quantifiable characteristic. It's subjective, and by its very nature, it's resistant to classification. And because it's so difficult to classify, I also don't propose to find any one kind of liminality in the works that follow. Instead, I propose that we can reframe works of the past and find new access points into contemporary works by more proactively embracing the state of liminality. In other words, a state which is not only resistant to objective categorization, but which celebrates that very resistance. Throughout this lecture, I'm going to examine how a number of musical parameters can be viewed as manifestations of liminality, touching on performance practice, perception, harmony, historiography, and the bodily experience of the performer. On the 28th of February, 1890, Joseph Joachim was playing a concert in London. The centerpiece of his performance was Bach's Sonata No. 3 in C major for unaccompanied violin. The piece was still not widely performed in his era, and he was already considered unusual for daring to perform it without a piano accompaniment. Among the audience was the great playwright and critic George Bernard Shaw, and he wrote a review. Quote, "Joachim played Bach's Sonata in C at the Bach Choir concert at St. James's Hall on Tuesday. The second movement of that work is a fugue some 300 or 400 bars long,
Of course, you cannot really play a fugue in 3 continuous parts on the violin, but by dint of double stopping and dodging from one part to another, you can evoke a hideous ghost of a fugue that will pass current if guaranteed by Bach and Joachim. He continues, "It was horrible, damnable. Had he been an unknown player introducing an unknown composer, he would not have escaped with his life." End quote. I love this quote because it's wonderfully colorful, but it also raises some very important points. And for this lecture, I'd like to focus in on 3 of those points. I call them the known composer, the known work, and the hideous ghost. Let's consider part of Shaw's review again. Quote, "Had Joachim been an unknown player introducing an unknown composer, he would not have escaped with his life." What Shaw is getting at here is that before we ever arrive at a concert hall, to some extent we've already pre-heard that performance, and that filters our listening experience. Tonight, for example, I'll play the fugue from the A minor sonata. The audience knows this piece before I ever set my bow to my strings, and even if they don't, they know Bach. By putting Bach's name on the program, it's as if he, the known composer, or the marble bust, is speaking out across the centuries. And what is he saying? Well, as Shaw puts it, the known composer guarantees that what I'm about to perform will meet certain criteria and fit within certain boundaries. But once a composer becomes a known composer on the level of Bach, we lose sight of any liminal characteristics in their music because we get caught in a paradox. How can we imagine the known composer pursuing liminal concepts if we also say that that composer was instrumental in defining the very boundaries of our traditional classical music canon? And of course, the known composer writes what the canon would probably call known works. And to become a known work, a piece must be inscribed on paper, clearly laid out as a textual object. If we consider Bach's violin fugues again, well, they're definitely known works. On paper, their identity is very clear, too. They're fugues, because it says so right on the can. They have row upon row of neatly stacked vertical chords, and of course, Bach himself called them fugues. Surely that's the end of the story. But Shaw poked at this when he said, quote, "Of course you cannot really play a fugue in 3 continuous parts on the violin, but by dint of double stopping and dodging from one part to another, you can evoke a hideous ghost of a fugue." This statement, 130 years later, still feels a little insulting. But of course, Shaw isn't wrong, especially if we talk about the violin fugues not as objects on paper, but as performances. For a keyboard composer like Bach, a fugue has to mean, first and foremost, the simultaneous sounding of contrapuntal voices. But of course, the technical boundaries of the violin inevitably prevent that level of simultaneous sounding as soon as we get to something like a 3-voice fugue. We have to spread the chords apart a little bit in order to play each voice. In other words, as soon as we begin to render the score into audible music, Bach's violin fugues aren't anymore quite what they say on the can. They're ghosts of fugues, illusions conjured by sleight of hand and given life by the ability of the listener to fill in the blanks. And it's important to note that Bach himself recognized that violin fugues were just a liminal adaptation of the fugue form. His student J.F. Agricola noted that Bach, quote, "often played the solo violin pieces on the clavichord, adding as much in the nature of harmony as he thought necessary," end quote. So already we know that Bach is using his keyboard to, if you will, put meat on the bones of this hideous ghost. And when it comes to the A minor fugue, we're lucky enough that we have Bach's own keyboard arrangement. And here in the fugue, Bach isn't just adding harmony as he saw fit, but he's floridly expanding on each of the voices of the fugue. Now, he put it in D minor for the keyboard, but otherwise you can see in all of these red box areas where he was adding detail that wasn't originally there. So the violin version, of course, came first. But it's clear from this keyboard arrangement that the violin version was never the most fully worked out iteration of the fugue in Bach's mind. The violin fugue is a carefully constructed magic trick, balancing between the limitations of a monophonic instrument and the demands of a polyphonic structure. So the performance of a violin fugue is also a rendering of liminality. Bach left for the performer a score which is on the threshold of a complete fugue. The performer actualizes it in a way which wavers between monophony and polyphony, and the listeners themselves take on a liminal performative role as they interpret and fill in the blanks of the musical apparition before them. For part two, we move to Italy in the 1970s to consider two composers who were also exploring the liminal spaces around and within the violin, this time in the context of the Italian avant-garde. What's interesting here are the ways that these two works for solo violin inhabit spaces between form and formlessness, possible and impossible, and between pitch and noise. They're suspended also between the forces of historical violin virtuosity and the shifting demands and aesthetics of the late 20th century. Out of these tensions and uncertain boundaries come works that demand extreme virtuosity, not for its own sake, but as a way of evoking extraordinary colors and shapes that challenge our conceptions of what the violin sounds like. Salvatore Sciarrino was born in 1947, and he's perhaps the best-known representative of the Italian avant-garde still alive today. And he was, of course, a visiting composer here at U of T in winter 2017. The scholar Michael Webb has highlighted Sciarrino's fascination with silence, particularly a silence that carries intense expression and meaning. Quote, "Although other Italians before him had increasingly explored silence, none of them had succeeded so well in charging the pauses with such intense emotion." The composer has compared his use of silence with the artist Kandinsky's use of the color white, a silence that is not dead, but full of potential. So Sciarrino's concept of silence acknowledges the role of silence as a liminal, transitory, and meaningful state that both reflects on the sound that just took place and anticipates the next sound event. Lucia D'Errico has written how Sciarrino also explores liminality through the production of sound. Quote, "Using traditional instruments, Sciarrino explores their sonic peripheries, sometimes through the use of extreme virtuosity, sometimes exploring the extremes of the pitch range, always in a sonic and physical, marginal or border zone. The sound descends towards the subhuman, crackles, whistles, puffs, screams, groans, roars, and trills, or it evaporates towards the suprahuman, ghosts, phantoms, illusions, and doubles." End quote. Sciarrino's Sei Capricci, completed in 1976, embody these principles of active silence and marginal sound. Tonight I'll be performing and discussing the second caprice of the set of 6. The second caprice is made up of a string of breath-like gestures. Each gesture is delineated by dal-niente signs on both sides of a crescendo-decrescendo. Much like natural breathing, these gestures ebb and flow slightly in their length and character, but they always return to an intuitive rhythm. The inner contents of each breath are, for the most part, double-stopped natural harmonics. Of course, certain natural harmonics on the violin, say at the octave, are pure, reliable, and resonant. But Sciarrino doesn't ask for those ones. He asks for harmonics from further up the harmonic series that stray further from equal temperament tuning and have an increasing likelihood of failing to speak clearly. Sciarrino further accentuates this unclear effect by always writing trills on one of the double-stopped voices. The trilling finger disrupts the already fragile harmonic, and the result is an indefinite sound with inconsistent pitch. Idiomatic writing for the violin typically means respecting the boundaries of the instrument's physical properties. In other words, not asking it to do things it can't. But Sciarrino's writing transgresses those boundaries, compelling the instrument to be in a perpetual state of imminent failure. A continual wavering between pitched sounds and their failed counterparts creates a liminal soundscape that rejects the pitch-centric norm of the violin repertoire. And in a similar fashion, Sciarrino's technical demands put the violinist at the outer limits of their physical capabilities and at the outer limits of their usual role as a solo violinist. The score demands extreme left and right-hand dexterity, but only in the service of rendering just quiet trills and whispers and hums. And as if to further degrade any illusion that the performer's virtuosity is the focus, the dynamics tend to be extremely soft, except for periodic leaps up to fortissimo. In other words, the performer can't make the dynamics relative. You can't just make them all a nice medium dynamic. The very softest dynamics must in fact be virtually inaudible. Yet, at the end of it, this struggle against the physics of the human body and against the physics of the violin gives rise to some of the most effervescent, luminous, delicate sound worlds in the violin literature. By writing these very physical, virtuosic pieces and titling them caprices, it's clear that on some level he's invoking the legacy of Paganini. Yet, in the words of the scholar Bacciagiaco, quote, Sciarrino points towards the gestural world of Niccolò Paganini's 24 caprices without manipulating the musical code of his antecedent in any way. He does not quote Paganini or insert material derived from Paganini's scores, nor does he try to mimic anything that might be designated Paganini's style. Sciarrino evokes a memory of the original caprices, but an uncannily inverted one, as if the act of remembrance paradoxically coincided with the erasure of its object. Franco Donatoni was another late 20th century Italian composer of considerable importance, and he lived from 1927 to the year 2000. It's difficult to talk about his style in some respects because he deliberately changed it between every piece, making each work very distinct. But the most characteristic trait of his works is composition using what he called codes or automatic procedures. These could also be described as essentially algorithms. Donatoni would start with a relatively compact gesture, sometimes drawn from his own past work, and subject it to mathematical processes to modify it over time. In a 1990 pamphlet, he summarized his compositional goals as follows, quote, "Complexity of code, simplicity of results, and difficulty for others to know the nature of the code." Elsewhere, he also cites the importance of Bartók's idea of growth without development. So we see in Donatoni's works that an initial germinal idea might undergo internal changes over time, but it retains a consistent identity. And this sense of an idea unwinding across time is also something that Donatoni himself has addressed. He said he was creating, quote, "a music more determined by the linearization than the superimposition of the codes, rich in diverse and variegated articulations." Tonight, I'm performing and discussing Argo for solo violin. Argo was written in 1979 as a set of two pieces for violin, of which I'll play the first. The dictionary defines Argo as the language used by a particular type or group of people, and often more or less secret vocabulary and idiom unique to a particular group. Donatoni's own instrument was the violin, and it became clear to me while learning this piece that in one sense, this piece is speaking the argot of a violinist. That much was clear in the precision with which Donatoni pushed the boundaries of technical possibility. At the same time, the argot of the violinist is also made clear by some strikingly obvious nods to the two other major violin works of the Italian avant-garde. Very briefly, if you look on this slide, you'll notice the similarities between these passages from Argo and the paired works by Berio and Scerino. And both of those composers' works that are quoted here predate Argo. There's an intertextuality there linking Argo to the rest of the violin repertoire of its day. But, in another sense, Argo also speaks its own self-contained syntax. There's a narrative to its unfolding, but that narrative is obscured behind sort of a foreign dialect. And to crack this code, I'm reminded of one of the ways that linguistic code breakers work. If you notice recurring patterns in a coded text, you can make some assumptions about where some things like common vowels might be, and then you can start teasing apart the meaning of the code. In Argo, it's the same. At first, it presents as a jumbled, numbing cascade of information, but at the same time, it has small, recurring features that cumulatively help us sense the underlying structure. Without going too far down the music theory rabbit hole, if we look at just the first page, we see some clues of how this process works. The opening germinal gesture in the first red box gets respelled again recursively through the following sforzandi. And this kind of constant reference back to the opening sequence of pitches really defines most of the content that comes, although it's continually reframed in what Donatoni referred to as his diverse and variegated articulations. It's only through this recursive process of hearing scraps of recycled material that it becomes evident that the opening material is the root from which the whole piece grows. This sort of arcane way in which Donatoni reveals his structure manipulates the boundaries between our brain's very sophisticated pattern recognition circuits and our propensity to be overwhelmed by vast quantities of raw data. And for the performer too, the execution of Argo takes place in this sort of penumbral space between possible and impossible. The score itself is both organically handwritten and yet mechanically precise. And it presents this sort of impenetrable facade that it doesn't really look like something that's going to be playable. And that's actually how I came to play it. I first took it off the shelf of the McGill Music Library in 2017, and it looked so ludicrously difficult that I put it back on the shelf, kind of laughing a little bit. A couple of years later, I remembered it, and I thought as a kind of a joke with myself, well, how long would it take me to learn the first couple of lines? But once I started, one of the first things to jump out at me was the fact that, well, it's just barely possible. The speed would always be a challenge. It's marked to be played as fast as possible. So in other words, if you're getting comfortable, you're probably doing it wrong. But it was all engineered to fit the violin idiomatically. It's completely unrelenting for the left hand, but usually in scalar patterns that fall nicely on the fingers. The bow, too, is always a challenge, but the longest slurs were always just at the outermost limits of comfort. It's a piece that really comfortably rides the line between possible and impossible. And its fusion between raw technical difficulty and compelling gestural musicality speaks an argot that, on some level, is the linking language between all of the violin repertoire.
go?
Well, she got a little nervous in the, they only get to play once for classes,
Right.
so, it's kind of a big deal, but, no, she's doing great in chamber music, like, she's super keen and very responsive, when it comes to emails and
No, she's good,
I
she's good.
appreciate that.
I think Rosie's gonna be similar
Yeah.
in time. She's, also super keen and just wants to do well, so.
Who else has moved for you this year?
It's just Rosie, because,
Arlan?
what's her name left, or decided not to
Yeah,
return.
the rest of them.
Not 100% sure, except that there's family issues
Yeah.
that were part of the reason why she went through last year.
See, I didn't know she.
Yeah, she got in, for last year's events, and then she sent it in.
I didn't, I never saw her, so I just assumed I never saw her.
Her audition was, by video, we all watched her.
Right.
She's a former
And I
undergrad
remember,
student.
like, she had the issues with her hair.
That's right, with the right hand. She's quite good, she's quite strong, but I think there's family things that are kind of pushing her in a different direction, but I don't really have 100%.
So she wasn't even here last year.
She came for like
For the final part of this program, we're going to move laterally into a sound world not totally different from Sciarino's, but where Sciarino's caprice seemed to artfully dodge any sense of being directly descended from Paganini. The two composers in this portion are deeply involved with distorted references to the past. They cultivate soundscapes grounded in nostalgia, fragmented memories, and liminal tonalities. Serge Arcueil is a Quebecois composer living and working in Montreal. And as the quote on this slide mentions, his music is often built on a sense of referencing the past from a distinctly contemporary perspective. In 1991 and 1994, he wrote two pieces for solo violin that encapsulate a really idiosyncratic and unique perspective on the solo violin repertoire. They're titled Soliloquy 1 and 2. The composer's own program notes for the soliloquies have this to say, quote, "Like a diary, the soliloquies form the beginning of a suite of studies for solo violin, each like an inner dialogue, suddenly moving from meditative reverie to delirium. The first soliloquy is freely inspired by the harmony of J.S. Bach's Chaconne from the second partita. The second soliloquy, more brilliant, was written for the 1994 Canamex Stepping Stone competition." End quote. While the soliloquies contemplate inner dialogues, they also dialogue externally with space and with the existing violin repertoire. If we consider first the idea of dialoguing with space, soliloquy number 1 specifies that it is to be performed in a space with a reverberation time of at least 2 seconds. This is a pretty long time. Even symphonic concert halls tend to have reverb times that barely approach a full 2 seconds. The most common concert setting that could achieve this reverb time would be something like a large church. And of course, practical considerations stop me from doing that today. But if we think about the reverb, it can still give us some clues into the nature of this piece. On the one hand, we have to consider that an inner dialogue taking place in a church has a very different, more serious, reflective tone than one that would just take place on a concert stage. But this reverb also fundamentally changes the purposes of Arcueil's harmonic writing and his use of rests. Even though he'll always notate complex musical figures with great precision, their unusual harmonies will, in this kind of a reverb, 2 seconds, lose definition and become much more blurred and gestural than they would otherwise appear on the page. Later in the piece, in an arpeggiated section that calls to mind Bach's Chaconne, unusual chord changes have their edges blurred by the reverb. We might expect, of course, the same phenomenon if we were playing, say, the Chaconne in a church. But Arcueil is deliberately manipulating this reverb. He leaves these short fermatas at strategic points to allow the reverb to clear. He's thereby establishing a hierarchy of harmonic changes between these chords. There are those which blur into the next, and there are those which are given a clear start after a fermata. There are lots of other references to the Chaconne in this piece. It's not just about the harmony, I would say. But the most direct reference is the very opening, also shown on this slide on the lower edge of it, where there's a fragmented direct quote of the opening of the Chaconne. Although in Arcueil's version, it very quickly melts down into a very different harmonic world. Soliloquy 2 is a more virtuosic and technically challenging work than the first, maybe reflecting its origins as a competition commission. In both soliloquies, though, Arcueil's harmonic language is mostly octatonic. And this tonality still sounds unusual to our ears, but it also calls to mind composers like Debussy and Stravinsky. So there's another reference to the past baked in here. Now, there are only 2 possible octatonic scales, depending on whether the first interval is a half step or a whole step. And Arcueil uses those 2 collections of pitches as opposing tonal areas, in a similar fashion to the more familiar tonal opposition of tonic and dominant key areas. By opposing and combining pitches drawn from these 2 sets, he creates a suspended sensation of tonality that's been robbed of its traditional functions. But also, by being octatonic at all, these harmonics carry an underlying sense of exoticism and restlessness, long exploited since composers like Debussy. It's also worth noting, in measures 34 to 36, Arcuri does, of the second soliloquy, Arcuri does quote the Bach motif, so B flat, A, C, B natural. As you can see in the slide, he does write it transposed and ornamented with extra notes and articulations and dynamics, but if we simplify it a bit and take it down to minor seventh, it's not particularly hidden. Now, as we saw with Sciorino, the certain level and style of virtuosity of this work, Soliloquy 2, automatically generates a historical reference to things like Paganini. And as we've mentioned, the octatonic tonality also carries a historical reference. But this Bach motif, appearing in a decorated and fragmented version, is much more powerful. It doesn't just present as an homage or a suggestion or a nod to the educated listener. What's successful is that it appears as a blurred and complex vision, one that's been changed. It acknowledges that we can only consider music of the past through a flawed and distorted lens. Signs, Games, and Messages is an ongoing collection of very short pieces by the Hungarian composer György Kurtag, who is thankfully still with us and writing music at the ripe old age of 94. He's been writing pieces like these since he started with a series of pieces called Games in 1973. He started composing these works primarily for piano, but he frequently reworks them for other instruments like the violin. The title Signs, Games, and Messages really refers to three separate streams of composition, not a single body of work under one title. There's no set order or quantity of these pieces. They each stand on their own and each represent a sign, a game, or a message. Now, those three words have specific meanings for Kurtag. Talking about signs, Kurtag said in an interview, quote, "The sign may also have originated in my life as a Boy Scout. We go and leave a sign on the tree that we've been there. The composer does exactly the same. I leave this sign for you. If you want it, use it. If you don't, discard it." About games, the scholar Rachel Beckles-Wilson describes them as, quote, "mere objets trouvé." The very brevity of Kurtag's games maximizes the ephemeral aspect of music. Games offer very elusive moments of presence that evaporate almost as they are heard, end quote. Beyond this, it's worth noting that the majority of Kurtag's games have originated as pedagogical pieces for the piano, where they each explore a different aspect of expression or extended technique. And finally, messages are pieces that he dedicates to people, usually in a fairly cryptic sort of way. Now, these pieces are really fascinating to me because they're very flexible and open-ended, and yet very compact at the same time. And that's kind of a rare thing. When we think about another compact composer like, say, Webern, we think of things being very tightly controlled. But Kurtag might have more in common with something like a Fluxus piece. These are often short, single-idea pieces that could be explored a lot of different ways by the performer. Kurtag's notational practices try to encourage that, and on the right side of this slide I have one of his explanatory legends of symbols. Most of these markings are aimed at highlighting agogic inflection points or expressive devices, and he does a lot of implied or explicit osseas, so he gives you options. The study of these works is really a study in contradictions and gray areas. For example, some of those options are you can play this part triple piano or triple fortissimo. He leaves some of these choices to the performer. And Kurtog's sound world here tends to overall sort of murmur and dissipate and pulse and ask more questions than it answers. It makes references to external works, but they're usually kind of a fractured reference. He leaves ideas unfinished, seemingly, and interpretations are throughout just left completely wide open. Now, in the spirit of these works, I'm not going to tell you what each little one is about, but I am going to clarify the titles. So I'd like to note the following. The first selection, Nip Delphila, translates as a folk song. The second selection, Doloroso, bears a meaning specific to Kurtog. In an interview, he clarified that Doloroso refers specifically to an intense inner pain. There's another selection in memoriam of his deceased violinist friend Stefan Romașcanu, and the very last selection is a tribute to the same JSB that began this program. These are the last pieces of the evening. So thank you very much for attending from near or from far. Please enjoy Kurtog's Signs, Games, and Messages.